The dust kicked up from Martha Henderson's worn boots as she walked the familiar path toward the sprawling Cartwright ranch, her 8-year-old daughter Lucy's small hand clasped firmly in hers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas plains, and the air already carried the promise of another scorching day. Martha had been working as a seamstress and cook for various families in the town of Cedar Ridge for the past 3 years, ever since her husband Thomas had died in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but debts and a young daughter to raise. Today marked a new chapter in their difficult journey, as she had finally secured steady employment at the largest ranch in the county, owned by the wealthy and influential William Cartwright. Martha had heard whispers about Cartwright throughout the town. Some spoke of his generosity toward his workers, while others mentioned his mysterious past and the way he had arrived in Cedar Ridge 15 years ago with enough money to buy the largest spread of land anyone had ever seen. He was a man who kept to himself, rarely venturing into town except for business, and despite being in his early 40s and considered quite handsome by the local women, he had never married. The townspeople speculated endlessly about his bachelor status, creating elaborate theories about lost loves and broken hearts, but Cartwright himself never encouraged such gossip with explanations or denials. As they approached the impressive ranch house with its wraparound porch and freshly painted white walls, Martha felt a mixture of nervousness and hope. This job would provide them with steady income and a small cabin on the property where she and Lucy could live rent-free. It represented security in a world that had offered them precious little of it since Thomas's death. She had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, taking in laundry, mending clothes, and cooking for whoever would pay her, but it was barely enough to keep them fed and housed. The opportunity to work for Cartwright had come through Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the town's schoolteacher, who had recommended Martha's skills to the rancher when his previous housekeeper had moved back east to live with her sister. Lucy skipped beside her mother, her bright blue eyes taking in every detail of their new surroundings. The little girl had inherited her father's striking azure eyes and her mother's chestnut hair, creating a combination that always drew second glances from strangers. She chattered excitedly about the horses she could see in the distant pastures and the chickens pecking around the yard, her innocent enthusiasm a sharp contrast to her mother's nervous energy. Martha had explained to Lucy that this would be their new home and that she would need to be on her best behavior, especially when meeting Mr. Cartwright for the first time. The ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Jake Morrison, met them at the front steps of the main house. He was a weathered cowboy who had worked for Cartwright since the beginning and was known throughout the area for his fair treatment of the ranch hands and his unwavering loyalty to his employer. Jake tipped his hat respectfully to Martha and smiled kindly at Lucy, immediately putting them both at ease with his gentle demeanor. He explained that Mr. Cartwright was in his study, reviewing the books, and would meet with them shortly to discuss the terms of employment and show them to their new quarters. As they waited on the porch, Martha smoothed down Lucy's dress and adjusted her own modest hat, wanting to make the best possible impression. She had sewn new dresses for both of them using fabric she had purchased with her last bit of savings, determined that they would look respectable when meeting their new employer. The sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden floors inside the house announced Cartwright's approach, and Martha felt her heart rate quicken with anticipation. She had only seen him from a distance during his infrequent visits to town, and she hoped he would prove to be the fair and decent man that Jake Morrison's continued employment suggested he was. The front door opened, and William Cartwright stepped onto the porch, his tall frame filling the doorway as he prepared to greet his new employees. He was indeed an imposing figure, with broad shoulders, silver-streaked dark hair, and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successful business dealings and ranch management. His clothes were well-made but practical, reflecting both his wealth and his hands-on approach to running his operation. He had prepared himself for a routine introduction to his new housekeeper and her child, expecting nothing more than a brief exchange of pleasantries before getting back to the pressing business of running a cattle ranch. However, the moment William Cartwright's gaze fell upon young Lucy Henderson, his entire world shifted on its axis. The confident smile he had prepared for the introduction froze on his lips, and his face went pale as if he had seen a ghost from his past. Those unmistakable blue eyes, so bright and clear, staring back at him with innocent curiosity, struck him like a physical blow. He gripped the porch railing to steady himself, his mind reeling with memories he had spent 15 years trying to bury. The eyes were identical to those of someone he had loved and lost long ago, someone whose memory had haunted him through every lonely night on the ranch. Martha noticed the rancher's strange reaction immediately and felt a cold fear creep into her stomach. Had she made some terrible mistake? Was there something wrong with Lucy's appearance that would cost them this desperately needed opportunity? She instinctively pulled her daughter closer, unsure of what had caused such a dramatic change in Cartwright's demeanor. Jake Morrison also observed his employer's unusual behavior with growing concern, having never seen the typically composed rancher display such obvious distress. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Cartwright continued to stare at Lucy, his breathing shallow and his complexion ashen. Finally, Cartwright managed to compose himself enough to speak, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his inner turmoil. He welcomed Martha to the ranch and expressed his hope that she would find the work suitable, but his eyes kept drifting back to Lucy with an intensity that made Martha increasingly uncomfortable. He asked routine questions about Martha's experience and expectations, but his responses to her answers were distracted and mechanical, as if his mind was elsewhere entirely. When Lucy smiled up at him and politely introduced herself with the confidence her mother had taught her, Cartwright's hands actually shook as he acknowledged her greeting. The tour of the ranch house proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that everyone present could feel, but no one could fully understand. Cartwright showed them the kitchen where Martha would prepare meals, the laundry room where she would handle the washing, and the various other areas of the house that would fall under her care. His usual pride in his well-appointed home seemed completely absent, replaced by an almost frantic energy that made him speak too quickly and move with jerky, unnatural motions. Martha tried to focus on the practical aspects of her new duties, but she found herself constantly glancing at her employer's face, trying to decipher the source of his obvious agitation. When they reached the small but comfortable cabin that would serve as Martha and Lucy's new home, Cartwright's composure finally cracked completely. As Lucy ran ahead to explore the two-room dwelling with childish excitement, examining the simple furniture and exclaiming over the view of the mountains from the single window, Cartwright turned to Martha with an expression of desperate confusion. He asked her, with barely controlled emotion, about Lucy's father and the circumstances of his death. Martha, taken aback by the personal nature of the questions and the intensity with which they were asked, provided the basic facts about Thomas Henderson's mining accident, but wondered why her new employer seemed so interested in her late husband's background. Cartwright's questions became increasingly specific and urgent. He wanted to know where Thomas had worked before the mining accident, where he and Martha had met, and how long they had been married. Martha answered truthfully, explaining that she and Thomas had met in Denver 7 years earlier, had married quickly, and had moved to Cedar Ridge when Lucy was just 2 years old because Thomas had found work in the local silver mine. She mentioned that Thomas had been somewhat secretive about his past, claiming he preferred to focus on their future together rather than dwelling on old memories, but that she had never pressed him for details because she had loved him deeply and trusted his judgment. As Martha spoke, Cartwright's face went through a series of complex emotions that she couldn't begin to interpret. Relief, anguish, hope, and fear seemed to battle for control of his features. When she finished her account, He stood silently for several long minutes, staring out at the horizon as if trying to make sense of information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own life. Finally, he turned back to her and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Lucy reminded him strongly of someone he had once known, someone very important to him who had disappeared from his life many years ago. Martha felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of Cartwright's words began to sink in. She looked at her daughter, who was now arranging wildflowers she had picked in a small jar on the cabin's table, and tried to process what she was hearing. Thomas had never spoken of his time before they met, always deflecting her gentle inquiries with kisses and promises that their future was all that mattered. She had accepted his reluctance to discuss his past as a quirk of his character, never imagining that there might be significant secrets hidden in those unspoken years. That evening, after Martha had prepared dinner for Cartwright and settled Lucy into bed in their new cabin, she found herself unable to sleep. She sat on the small porch, looking up at the star-filled sky and replaying every moment of their first day at the ranch. Cartwright's reaction to Lucy had been so extreme and so obviously connected to some deep emotional wound that Martha couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their situation than she had realized. The way he had stared at her daughter wasn't simply the appreciation of a man who enjoyed children. It was the desperate gaze of someone who recognized something precious that he thought he had lost forever. The next few days passed in a strange atmosphere of tension and careful politeness. Martha threw herself into her work with determination, proving her worth as a housekeeper and cook while trying to ignore the way Cartwright watched Lucy whenever he thought no one was looking. The rancher made excuses to spend time around the house, abandoning his usual routine of riding out with the hands to check on the cattle, and instead finding reasons to remain close to the domestic areas where he might encounter the little girl. He would appear in the kitchen while Martha was cooking, ostensibly to discuss household matters, but his attention would invariably drift to Lucy if she was playing nearby. Lucy, for her part, seemed completely unaware of the adult undercurrents swirling around her. She adapted to ranch life with the resilience of childhood, making friends with the barn cats, learning the names of the horses, and charming every cowboy she met with her bright smile and endless questions about ranch work. She took to following Jake Morrison around when her mother's duties kept her busy, and the old foreman delighted in teaching her about cattle and horses with the patience of a grandfather. The other ranch hands also took a protective interest in the little girl, impressed by her fearlessness around animals and her eagerness to learn about their way of life. Martha noticed that Cartwright's behavior toward her had also changed since their arrival. While he remained scrupulously professional and respectful, there was an underlying intensity to their interactions that made her increasingly uncomfortable. He asked seemingly casual questions about her life with Thomas, about Lucy's habits and preferences, and about their family history in ways that felt more like an interrogation than polite conversation. Martha began to feel as if she and her daughter were being studied like specimens under a microscope, and the sensation made her skin crawl despite her gratitude for the steady employment. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after their arrival, Martha was cleaning up the dinner dishes when she discovered Cartwright standing in the doorway to the kitchen, holding an old photograph in his trembling hands. The expression on his face was one of such profound pain and longing that Martha instinctively moved toward him, her natural compassion overriding her growing unease about his behavior. When she asked if something was wrong, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of years of regret and showed her the photograph without speaking. The image was of a beautiful young woman with dark hair and striking blue eyes, eyes that were unmistakably identical to Lucy's in every detail, from their unusual shade to their distinctive shape. The woman in the photograph was smiling at the camera with joy and love, wearing a simple white dress that suggested the picture had been taken on her wedding day. Martha felt her legs go weak as the full implication of what she was seeing crashed over her like a wave. This woman, whoever she was, shared Lucy's most distinctive feature in a way that could not possibly be coincidental. Cartwright's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with emotion as he told Martha the story he had never shared with another living soul. The woman in the photograph was Catherine Morrison, Jake's younger sister, who had come to work for him as his housekeeper 15 years earlier when the ranch was just getting established. Catherine had been beautiful, intelligent and kind, and Cartwright had fallen deeply in love with her within months of her arrival. They had planned to marry, and the photograph had been taken on the day he proposed, when she had agreed to become his wife and had tried on the wedding dress that belonged to his mother. But Catherine had disappeared just weeks before their planned wedding, vanishing without a trace or explanation in the middle of the night. Cartwright had searched frantically for months, hiring investigators and following every lead, convinced that something terrible had happened to her. Jake had been equally devastated by his sister's disappearance, and the two men had bonded over their shared grief and determination to find answers. When years passed without any word from Catherine or any clue about what had become of her, Cartwright had finally accepted that she was probably dead, though he never stopped hoping that someday he would learn the truth about what had happened to the woman he loved. Martha listened to this story with growing horror and understanding, the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed falling into place with sickening clarity. She thought about Thomas's secretiveness about his past, his insistence on moving to a small town far from Denver where no one would know them, and his reluctance to let her form close friendships with other families in Cedar Ridge. She remembered how he had sometimes seemed nervous when strangers looked too closely at Lucy, and how he had always been quick to change the subject when anyone commented on their daughter's unusual and striking eyes. The implications of what Cartwright was suggesting were almost too overwhelming to process. If Catherine Morrison had been Lucy's mother, then Thomas Henderson had not been the man Martha thought she had married. He had been someone else entirely, someone who had taken Catherine away from the man she was supposed to marry and had somehow convinced her to abandon her life and identity. But that would mean that Lucy was not Martha's biological daughter. A possibility that seemed impossible given how much the little girl looked like Thomas and how clearly Martha remembered giving birth to her. Cartwright seemed to read the confusion and disbelief in Martha's face, and he quickly explained that he wasn't suggesting Lucy was Catherine's daughter in the way she was thinking. Catherine had disappeared before their wedding, so there had been no child. But the eyes, those unmistakable Morrison family eyes that had been passed down through generations, suggested a connection that couldn't be ignored. What if Thomas Henderson had been using a false name? What if he had been someone from Catherine's past? Someone she had run away with in a moment of doubt about her upcoming marriage? The conversation continued late into the night, with Martha struggling to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about her own life. Cartwright showed her other photographs of the Morrison family, pointing out the distinctive blue eyes that appeared in generation after generation. Jake's eyes were the same shade, as were those of his father in an old daguerreotype, and his grandfather in a painted portrait that hung in the ranch office. It was a family trait so specific and unusual that its appearance in Lucy seemed to demand an explanation that went beyond simple coincidence. Over the following days, Martha found herself observing Lucy with new eyes, looking for clues she might have missed about her daughter's true parentage. But everything she remembered about Lucy's birth and early years seemed genuine and consistent with her being Thomas and Martha's natural child. She had clear memories of her pregnancy, of Lucy's birth, and of the exhausting early months of motherhood. Yet Cartwright's certainty about the significance of Lucy's eyes planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day. The breakthrough came when Martha was going through Thomas's few remaining possessions, items she had kept in a small wooden box since his death. Hidden beneath some papers and a few pieces of jewelry was a letter she had never seen before, written in Thomas's handwriting, but addressed to someone named Catherine. The letter was dated just a few months before Thomas's death, and its contents revealed a man tormented by guilt and regret about choices he had made years earlier. In the letter, Thomas begged Catherine's forgiveness for taking her away from the life she had planned, acknowledged that he had been selfish in convincing her to run away with him, and expressed his hope that she had found happiness despite the pain he had caused her. The letter made it clear that Thomas Henderson was indeed a false identity, and that the man Martha had married had once been involved with Catherine Morrison in some way that had led to her disappearance from Cartwright's ranch. But the letter also revealed that Catherine had died several years after they had run away together, before Martha had ever met the man she knew as Thomas. This meant that Lucy was definitely Martha's biological daughter, but it also meant that Thomas had been carrying the burden of his past relationship with Catherine throughout their entire marriage. When Martha showed the letter to Cartwright, his reaction was a mixture of relief and renewed grief. He was glad to finally know what had happened to Catherine, to learn that she hadn't been murdered or died alone somewhere. But he was also devastated to have confirmation that the woman he had loved was truly gone forever. The letter revealed that Thomas's real name had been Michael Catherine's childhood sweetheart, who had returned to Cedar Ridge just as she was preparing to marry Cartwright. Michael had convinced Catherine that their young love was worth more than the security and comfort that marriage to the wealthy rancher would provide, and she had chosen to run away with him rather than go through with the wedding. The revelation explained so much about Thomas's behavior during their marriage, his occasional moments of melancholy, and his insistence on building a life far from anyone who might have known him in his previous identity. He had genuinely loved Martha and Lucy, but he had also been haunted by the knowledge that his happiness had come at the cost of breaking Catherine's engagement and causing pain to both her and Cartwright. The letter suggested that he had intended to tell Martha the truth about his past someday, but death had claimed him before he found the courage to share his secrets. As the weeks passed, an unusual relationship began to develop between Martha, Lucy, and Cartwright. The rancher's initial shock and confusion gave way to a deep fascination with Lucy, not because he believed she was connected to Catherine, but because she represented a living link to the woman he had loved and lost. He began to see Martha not just as his employee, but as someone who had shared a life with the man who had taken Catherine away from him. Instead of resentment, however, Cartwright felt a strange kind of gratitude toward Martha for having given Thomas the love and family that had apparently brought him peace in his final years. Lucy, meanwhile, began to view Cartwright as a kind of substitute grandfather figure, drawn to his obvious affection for her and his willingness to answer her endless questions about the ranch and the surrounding countryside. She was too young to understand the complex emotional dynamics at play, but she sensed that this man cared about her in a special way, and she responded to his attention with the open trust that children reserve for adults who make them feel safe and valued. For Martha, the situation was more complicated. She was grateful for Cartwright's kindness to Lucy and for his understanding about Thomas's deception, but she also felt uncomfortable with the intensity of his interest in their lives. She worried that he might be trying to use them as a way to maintain some connection to Catherine's memory, and she didn't want Lucy to become a substitute for the child he and Catherine might have had together. At the same time, she couldn't deny that their life at the ranch was better than anything she could have provided for Lucy on her own, and she was reluctant to jeopardize their security by questioning Cartwright's motivations too closely. The resolution to their complicated situation came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, who had been watching the developments with the wisdom of someone who understood both his employer's pain and his sister's memory. One evening, Jake approached Martha while she was sitting on her cabin porch after putting Lucy to bed, and he shared his own perspective on what had transpired. He told her that Catherine had indeed loved Michael when they were young, but that she had chosen to accept Cartwright's proposal because she believed it was the practical thing to do for her family's financial security. Jake revealed that he had always wondered if Catherine might have been happier with her first love, even though he had supported her decision to marry Cartwright because he believed the rancher would be good to her. Learning that she had ultimately chosen love over security, even though it had led to her early death, gave Jake a sense of peace about his sister's choices. He also observed that Cartwright's interest in Lucy was not about trying to replace Catherine or recapture the past, but about finding a way to honor her memory by caring for the child of the man she had chosen. This conversation helped Martha understand that Cartwright's behavior was not as troubling as she had feared, but rather represented a man's attempt to make peace with old wounds and find meaning in unexpected connections. She began to see that his growing affection for Lucy was genuine and healthy, not an attempt to use her daughter as a replacement for someone else. She also realized that Thomas's deception, while painful to discover, had ultimately been motivated by love and regret rather than malice or selfishness. As autumn arrived at the ranch, bringing cooler temperatures and the busy season of preparing for winter, the strange family unit that had formed around the revelation of Thomas's true identity began to settle into a comfortable routine. Cartwright continued to run his ranch with the same efficiency and fairness that had made him successful, but he also made time each day to spend with Lucy, teaching her to ride and sharing stories about the land and its history. Martha found her role expanding beyond that of a simple housekeeper, as Cartwright increasingly sought her opinions on ranch matters and included her in decisions about improvements to the property. Lucy thrived in this environment, growing confident and strong under the combined attention of her mother and the man who had become an important father figure in her life. She learned to rope calves from Jake Morrison, to bake bread from her mother, and to read the weather signs from Cartwright, developing skills that would serve her well in the frontier life she was embracing. Her bright blue eyes, which had initially caused such turmoil, became a cherished reminder of the complex web of love and loss that had brought their unlikely family together. The story of Martha Henderson's arrival at the Cartwright Ranch with her daughter Lucy became one of those tales that the locals would tell for generations, embellished and modified with each retelling until it took on the quality of legend. Some versions focused on the dramatic moment when Cartwright first saw Lucy's eyes, while others emphasized the mysterious letter that revealed Thomas's true identity. But the heart of the story remained constant. A tale of how the past could reach across years to create unexpected connections, and how love could take many forms, from the romantic passion between young sweethearts to the protective devotion of a surrogate father and the quiet strength of a woman determined to build a good life for her child. Years later, when Lucy had grown into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her inherited determination, she would sometimes ask about the events that had brought them to the ranch and changed all their lives so dramatically. Martha would tell her the story of Thomas and Catherine, of Cartwright's lost love, and of the strange twist of fate that had brought healing to old wounds. Lucy would listen with the intensity of someone trying to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant for her own identity and future. The ranch prospered under Cartwright's continued leadership, and Martha's presence brought a warmth to the big house that it had lacked since Catherine's disappearance 15 years earlier. Travelers and neighboring ranchers began to comment on the change in Cartwright's demeanor, noting that the solitary man who had kept to himself for so long now seemed more open and engaged with the world around him. Some attributed this change to Martha's influence, while others believed it was Lucy's bright spirit that had brought new life to the isolated rancher. The truth, as is often the case in matters of the heart, was more complex than simple explanations could capture. Cartwright had indeed found a measure of peace through his connection to Martha and Lucy, but it was not the peace of replacement or substitution. Rather, it was the deeper satisfaction that came from understanding that love, once given, continues to ripple outward in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. Catherine's love for Michael had led to pain and separation, but it had also led to Martha's happiness and Lucy's existence, creating a chain of connection that honored the memory of all involved. As our tale draws to a close, we find our characters settled into their new lives with the contentment that comes from having weathered storms and found safe harbor. Martha had secured not just employment, but a place in a family that valued her contributions and cared for her well-being. Lucy had gained not just a home, but a community of adults who were invested in her future and committed to helping her grow into the strong woman she was destined to become. And Cartwright had found not just peace with his past, but hope for a future that honored his memories while embracing new possibilities. The blue eyes that had caused such a stir on that first morning continued to be Lucy's most striking feature, but they were no longer a source of mystery or pain. Instead, they became a symbol of the unexpected ways that life can weave together seemingly separate stories into a tapestry of meaning and connection. In the end, the widow who had taken her daughter to work had found much more than employment, and the wealthy rancher who had frozen at the sight of a child's eyes had discovered that some gifts from the past are meant not to torment us, but to guide us toward the love we didn't even know we were seeking. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories of adventure, mystery, and the indomitable spirit of frontier life. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, so tell us what you think happened to Lucy as she grew up on the ranch, and whether you believe she ever learned the full truth about her father's mysterious past. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories of the American frontier to life, so don't forget to share your thoughts and theories about the characters and their fates.